Well, good evening, everyone. We are so glad to have you with us tonight. My name is Charlene Margot, and I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, which produces this program, the Parent Education Series. Tonight, we have a really special event for you with Gregg Behr and Rydzewski, authors of the new book, When You Wonder You're Learning, Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, and Caring Kids. We first saw Gregg and Ryan at an educators conference with the Fred Rogers Center in Pittsburgh. And I remember saying to my parent venture partner, Bev Hartman, who's from Pittsburgh, we've got to find those guys. So we are just so really literally delighted and honored to have you with us tonight. Everybody, you're in for a great treat. This program, many people think that it's all about early childhood when you talk about Fred Rogers, but that's not the case. And I think tonight, Gregg and Ryan will make the case for why these are enduring lessons and why they matter for all of us as parents of kids who we want to raise to be caring, creative, and curious. So again, welcome to everybody. Before we get started, I want to say a big thank you to tonight's sponsors: the Redwood City School District, the Peninsula Healthcare District, Sequoia Healthcare District, and this program, the Parent Venture. Tonight's format is a webinar, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We're going to have about 35 minutes of content from Gregg and Ryan, and then we really want to hear from you, the audience. So since it's a webinar, we have both the chat button, where we'd like you to watch resources coming in that Bev will post. You can talk to us, talk to one another, but we'd like you to put your questions in the Q&A button. So comments and resources in the chat, and then questions in the Q&A. We will be looking at questions throughout the evening, and then again at the end, we have at least 15 minutes to answer them. So try to keep your questions kind of short and general if you can, so we can get to as many of them as possible. Also, at the very end, we'll drop in a really short survey link. We hope that you will take 1 minute to fill that out. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available soon on our video library, which is a free resource. You'll see the link in the chat tonight. It's become very popular. We've had over 26,000 views, including 15,000 in the last year. So we know that if you can't attend these events live, please do refer them to your partners, your friends, your colleagues, so they can watch on the video library. All right, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's keynote presenters. Rydzewski is a writer whose science and education reporting has garnered several awards and fellowships. A graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, he taught elementary school in South Louisiana before earning an MFA in nonfiction writing from Chatham University. As a freelancer, his magazine stories focus on everything from schools to space travel to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and his poems and other pieces have appeared in several journals. A native of Erie, Pennsylvania, Ryan lives in Pittsburgh with his wife, Jacqueline, whose name I think you have spelled right here, Ryan. Gregg Behr is a father, children's advocate, and director for the Grable Foundation, whose work is inspired by his hero, Fred Rogers. For more than a decade, Gregg has helped lead Remake Learning, a network of educators, scientists, artists, and makers he founded in 2007 to international renown. Formed in Rogers' real-life neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Remake Learning has turned heads everywhere from Forbes to the World Economic Forum for its efforts to ignite children's curiosity, encourage creativity, and foster justice and belonging in schools, libraries, museums, and more. A graduate of the University of Notre Dame and Duke, Gregg holds honorary degrees from Carlow University and St. Vincent College. He's an advisor to the Brookings Institution and the Fred Rogers Center, and he has been cited by former President Barack Obama as an innovator and thought leader. Please join me in a really warm welcome for tonight's speakers, Gregg and Ryan. Take it away, gentlemen.
Well, thank you so much, Charlene and Bev and the Parent Venture and the sponsors, and to all of you for coming. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Gregg, how do we look?
We look good. Hello, it says.
Great. Hello. So we're just going to jump right in. We'll talk a little bit more about ourselves in a minute, but who we're really here to talk about is this. This, of course, is Fred Rogers, the iconic television host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Now, if you're not familiar with The Neighborhood, it was a children's television program that aired from 1968 to 2001, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But for right now, we just want to start with a quick experiment. So If you grew up watching Mr. Rogers, if you grew up watching Fred on television, I want you to take just a moment to think about what that was like. What's one word or one phrase that comes to mind when you think about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? And you can just type it in the chat. We just want to get a sense of how people feel about Fred. Calming. Welcoming, definitely. Kind. Wonder, empathy, warm and safe. Belonging, kindness, absolutely.
So Ryan, I love seeing all these words. And me, I think of the word hope. Hope that with the tools for learning that Fred worked so hard to teach us, we would find within ourselves the strength to confront hard problems. Hope that caring adults would protect us, and that each of us would in turn become caring adults ourselves. So many of you remember Mr. Rogers, and you might also remember his favorite number. You know that he made you feel accepted, special, and safe, and you know that he loved you. 143 was his code for I love you. There's one letter in I, 4 letters in love, and 3 letters in you. Fred and his television program helped millions of kids feel loved. And in this slide, you're looking at 2 of them. As was noted, I'm Gregg Behr, Executive Director for the Grable Foundation and co-chair for an education ecosystem called Remake Learning. We'll come back to that later. And right next to me is Ryan Rydzewski, a science and education reporter and also a former elementary school teacher. We're both Western Pennsylvania kids. Like Fred himself, we were born here, we moved to different parts of the country, and eventually we found our ways back to these rolling hills of Western Pennsylvania. So those model houses in the neighborhood's opening sequence, well, they look just like our houses. When Fred took us on field trips, he took us to places we went in real life. Those were our libraries, our museums, our art centers, our gardens and factories. Fred, of course, was a national celebrity, but he felt like he was ours. And we had, and we still have, an emotional connection to him that many of you share. Fred had this extraordinary ability to connect with kids through television. And even today, nearly 20 years after his passing, his impact is still being felt. So in April of this year, after 3 years of research and lots of drafts, we published When You Wonder You're Learning. It's our book about Fred's enduring lessons and why they still matter today. And along the way, we learned a few things you might imagine. As we like to say, 14.3 things to be exact, 143. And we think after spending some time in the neighborhood today, you'll see why we're just as wide-eyed about Fred now as we were when we were kids, but maybe not for the reasons that you think.
So, lesson number 1, Fred Rogers was not a saint. Almost without exception, one of the first things we hear when we tell people about this book is, was Fred really like that? And of course, the subtext of that question is, no human being could possibly be so nice all the time. There's got to be some dark side, some secret that could shatter the myth of Mr. Rogers. But the truth is that Fred was exactly who we needed him to be. Now, it's different from saying he's perfect, because he wasn't. But really, we didn't need Fred to be perfect. We didn't need Fred to be a saint. What we needed instead was a regular guy, someone who, like Fred, despite all the flaws that come with being a human being, committed himself to being the person children needed him to be every day of his life. The Fred Rogers that we saw on screen was not an act, but a practice. It was a result of Fred's daily choices and his careful methods. One of the great honors of this book is having a foreword from his late wife, Joanne Rogers. And in it, she writes, "No one worked harder at being Fred Rogers than Fred Rogers himself." So, who was Fred Rogers and who was he working so hard to become?
Well, he was more than a nice guy in a sweater. Fred was born in 1928 in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, which is a small town just to the east of Pittsburgh. Now, we're not going to go too deeply into his background. Maybe some of you have read the fantastic biography that's out there. Maybe you've seen Morgan Neville's amazing documentary. But there are a couple things we think you ought to know if you want to understand the neighborhood. And the first thing is that Fred actually hated television when he first encountered it. The first thing he ever saw, he said, was people throwing pies in each other's faces, and it upset him to see people using the technology to demean each other like this. But despite that initial dislike, Fred saw the technology's potential. And so he decided, as he enrolled at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, that he wanted to use that technology to minister to children. And his teachers at the seminary said, well, if you're going to do that, you better study child development theory too. And that's how he ended up at Arsenal Children's Center in Pittsburgh. And this is an important part of the story because it was at Arsenal that he met some of the most brilliant psychologists and pediatricians and psychiatrists in all of the entire world who happened to be working there at the same time. There were folks like Benjamin Spock, the doctor whose book Baby and Childcare remains one of the best-selling books of all time. Maybe it's in your house or your parents' house or your grandparents' house. There was also Erik Erikson, the world-renowned psychologist. And most importantly, there was Margaret McFarland, a psychiatry professor who became Roger's lifelong mentor and dear friend. So studying at Arsenal put Fred at the cutting edge of child development science. And he took what he learned there and he blended it with original songs, with stories, with puppetry, building what eventually became Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Every aspect of the program, from Fred's wardrobe to the physical set itself, was grounded in science. And this is an incredibly overlooked part of his legacy. But Fred was more than a nice guy in a sweater. He's what today we would call a learning scientist. And in many ways, he was a learning scientist who was decades ahead of his time.
So today we know more than we ever have about how human beings learn. As a field, the science of learning includes everything from behavioral science to economics to artificial intelligence and more. There are people and organizations doing amazing work, trying to figure out the methods and the conditions that are most conducive to learning. And what's really fascinating about this stuff is the degree to which it validates, the degree to which it even mirrors what Fred Rogers was doing a half century ago in Pittsburgh. So take the title of our book, When You Wonder, You're Learning. This is a phrase that comes from a song of Fred's called Did You Know? Many of you might remember it. You can see some of the lyrics here on the left. Did you know it's all right to marvel? You can ask a lot of questions. Did you know when you wonder, you're learning? You can see it's really a song about the value of curiosity as it relates to getting smarter. Now compare these lyrics to this quote on the right from a research paper at the University of California at Davis. It says, curiosity may put the brain in a state that allows it to learn and return any kind of information, like a vortex that sucks in what you're motivated to learn and also everything around it. In other words, when you're curious, your brain starts to take in information. Mr. Rogers was right. When you wonder, you are learning. Now this research paper, by the way, came out in 2014. Fred wrote Did You Know in 1979. We could spend this entire talk talking about the ways in which learning science is just now catching up to what Fred was doing. But the bottom line is this: Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, if we want it to be, can be more than a pleasant memory in the minds of us adults. The neighborhood is also a blueprint. It's a resource. It's something that if we study can help point the way forward for kids and learning. So today we're going to talk a little bit about why Fred did what he did. We're going to talk about how Fred did it. And we're going to talk about what it can look like when caring adults, caring teachers, caring parents use Fred's blueprints to build learning spaces where every kid can thrive. And we use that term learning spaces intentionally because, as Fred knew,
learning happens everywhere. So you know the neighborhood. So you know the sheer variety of settings where learning took place. It was in his living room, at the library, the music shop, and the museum go-round, in a garden, at a crayon factory. That list goes on and on. The point being that Fred Rogers built Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Now he knew that classrooms and schools were critical, but he also knew that they were part of a learning landscape, a landscape in which learning happens everywhere. And part of the reason that we wrote this book is that because for the last 15 years, we've been building a landscape like that in Fred's backyard. So in our corner of the world, southwestern Pennsylvania, Remake Learning is this professional network of educators in and out of school, early childhood through higher education, who are working together to reimagine learning. This is a network that involves thousands of people from more than 600 organizations, schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, after-school programs, creative industries, campuses of higher education, all of whom are working together to create more engaging, more relevant, and more equitable learning opportunities for our young people who we know are navigating these times of rapid technological and social change. And because Remake Learning is situated here in Western Pennsylvania, we often say that the people involved in Remake Learning use the Fred method, referring of course to Fred Rogers. And when we say that, we mean that they're going about their work as Fred did. They're connecting whole child frameworks with what we're learning about learning itself. Think of it like a simple equation. Whole child plus learning sciences equals the Fred method. In so many ways, our book springs forth from this incredible learning landscape we call Remake Learning. It's work that's been underway for 15 years now, always centered on young people and the knowledge, the skills, the dispositions that we want to create for each and every learner. And as we think about every learner, in all of the places where they learn, yes, in schools, yes, in homes, but also in their neighborhoods, in those gardens, in those places where kids are learning just as they did in the neighborhood. We've thought about the building blocks that we want for our learners, especially now as we look to post-pandemic futures. And maybe we can get to this in the Q&A. What I can tell you is that you can dive into the work of Remake Learning because there are so many publications available at www.remakelearning.org that explain and dive deeper into the ways in which educators in and out of school are applying the Fred method every day in the extraordinary work that they do.
You know, one thing that links all these folks in the Remake Learning Network is that they are doing a version of what Fred did, which is teaching what Fred called the tools for learning. You know, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was an educational television show, but Fred never focused on things like spelling words or fractions. Instead, he focused on what he called the tools for learning. These were things like curiosity, creativity, and a few others that we'll get into in a minute. He said, I would rather give children the tools for learning. If we give them the tools, they'll want to learn the facts. And more importantly, they'll use the facts to build and not destroy. The point is that Fred knew that academic learning has to be paired with a nurturing of what's best in us. He knew that one without the other is insufficient. You need both in order to raise complete human beings. And here, again, learning science is proving Fred Rogers right.
And Fred's lessons matter more than maybe ever. Scientists, parents, employers, just about everyone now says that Fred's tools are essential to children's success, especially in this age defined by algorithms and increasingly smart machines. Now, one of the most amazing examples of this comes from Google, a place some of you are situated to very closely right now. So some of you may know that a few years back, the company tried to figure out what makes for a good boss. And for a long time, they assumed that the best programmers automatically made for the best managers. Fortunately, they decided to test this assumption with something that they internally called Project Oxygen. And through Project Oxygen, they analyzed 10,000 data points, things like performance reviews, employee surveys, exit interviews. And they found that while technical expertise was still important, it ranked nearly last among the things that mattered most. The other more important things were things like communication, things like caring about employees. They wanted all of these qualities that Fred taught so well, the very human qualities that cannot be replaced by machines. And when we help kids to develop these qualities, not only are we giving them the tools to succeed in their professional lives, we're also giving them the tools to discover themselves, to discover what intrigues them, what bothers them, what moves them, what brings them joy. Fred's tools have been shown to boost academics, health, and mental well-being. They are 10 times more predictive than our test scores. And they cost almost nothing to develop. They hinge on the very things that make life worth living: self-acceptance, close, loving relationships, and a deep regard for our neighbors. So Ryan, let's dig into the 6 chapters of our book.
Lesson 7, Fred nurtured our curiosity. So in 2007, a psychologist named Michelle Chenard published what we think is a really interesting study. Chenard and her colleagues recorded 4 children at regular intervals from the time they were about 14 months old until they were just older than 5. They recorded 230 hours of recorded conversation, trying to figure out what is it that when kids and parents are left to their own devices, what do they do? What do they talk about? And although their sample size was small, what Chenard and her colleagues found was revealing. When those 4 kids were left to their own devices, they did one thing in particular. And those of you with small children can probably guess what it was. These kids asked questions. They asked a lot of questions. They asked, on average, more than 100 questions per hour. So suffice it to say that kids are curious. Kids are inherently curious. You know, the world is a big, mystifying, messy, dirty, wonderful place, and they want to know how it works. And we know from modern learning science that the more curious kids are, the more their learning sticks. Susan Engel is one of the world's leading experts on this, and she says that inciting children's curiosity is the best way to ensure that they'll absorb and retain information. So you would think that as adults, inciting curiosity would be our top priority. But as most of you probably remember from your own time as a child, from your own time as a student, it's not always the case. In fact, when Engel herself went out into the field to study this, this is what she found. In kindergarten, in any given 2-hour stretch, we'd see anywhere from 2 to 5 questions or explorations. In 5th grade classrooms, the situation was even more striking. A typical 2-hour stretch often didn't yield one student question. So that's 2 hours in a classroom with no student questions, when we know that some kids, at least under the right conditions, would ask more than 100 questions per hour. How do we bridge that gap? How do we tap and nurture the natural curiosity that kids bring to us? Fortunately, Fred Rogers left us some blueprints. One of the most important things he learned from his mentor, Margaret McFarland, was the Quaker philosophy, that attitudes are caught, not taught. Fred knew how important it was to show viewers how curious he was himself. So if you watch basically any episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you'll find him telling viewers how many questions he has. You'll find him talking about how much he wants to know about the world. You'll find him assuring viewers that no matter where they go, no matter what they do together, Fred will be learning along with them because Fred is a learner too. It's what you bring to the children every day, he said. You're listening, you're caring, your enthusiasm, and you're responding to their ideas, thoughts, and feelings that encourages and inspires children to ask questions and to be imaginative. By responding thoughtfully to children's questions, you're encouraging their curiosity. Even when you don't know the answer, you're letting them know that it's good to wonder and ask. So while researching our book, one of the people we talked to was Hedda Sharapin, who was a producer on The Neighborhood who worked with Fred all the way back from the very first day of production back in the late 1960s. And Hedda gave us the example of an Ask It basket. Greg, do you want to talk about the Ask It basket?
You know, I love to talk about this. So we close each chapter with concrete examples of things you and I can do. So imagine a wicker basket, right? So Hedda walks into a classroom and she observes that the teacher in the front of the room has this wicker basket. And she's like, well, that's curious. I wonder what that's for. She's sitting in the back of the classroom watching the lesson unfold. And she recognizes immediately that this teacher has created an atmosphere where kids are asking questions. These older kids were like Engel's kindergartners, raising their questions, sometimes directly on point, and sometimes with questions that have come from right outside the left field wall. And what the teacher does is extraordinary. 1, she notices each and every question. 2, she acknowledges each question. 3, she then takes a moment to write down the question, deepening the respect for the question itself, and then puts it in the Ask It basket. And rather than quickly wanting or trying to answer the question, says, we're going to wonder about this question together later, and then creates the time and space for that to happen. Well, that's an extraordinary way of creating an atmosphere where kids know that they can comfortably ask questions, where their questions are going to be respected, where they feel like they're going to belong. And when together with a caring adult, they're going to have time and a space to explore the things that's on their mind. And that's something you and I can do right in our own kitchens. Importantly, Fred said that kids have to know that it's okay to wonder. And they have to know what it's okay to wonder about too. Fred knew that it was hard for kids, or for anyone for that matter, to be curious about something that's completely unfamiliar. So that's why Rogers, when introducing kids to something new, always started with something familiar. Maybe it was his fish tank, maybe it was his sandbox, or maybe it was crayons. Fred knew that curiosity doesn't spring from a void, but rather from something that's already known, a mystery that kids want to know something more about. So with the crayon, we might go off to a crayon factory. And while visiting that factory, we might learn how machines work and so on. Which leads us to lesson number 8. And that is that Fred protected our creativity. In 1968, George Land tested the creativity of 1,000 5-year-olds using a test he developed for NASA. And he found that 98% of those kids scored so highly that they qualified as creative geniuses. As with curiosity, kids are naturally creative. They make up stories and songs, they draw pictures. You know that they sometimes develop unusual, sometimes ingenious solutions to problems. But George Land discovered something else too. He tested that same group of 5-year-olds every 5 years. And at 10 years old, the share of creative geniuses fell from 98% to 30%. At 15 years old, it fell to 12%. And by adulthood, to 2%. 98% to 2%. Now, what Land and his team concluded was not that creativity naturally fades with age, but rather that non-creative behaviors learned. We learn to become less expressive. We learn to be less open to new ideas and new ways of thinking. We learn to be less innovative to life's challenges. And Fred himself talked about this. What happens if children hear that their mud pies are no good and their block buildings have no importance? So how do we protect and nurture the creativity that kids are born with? How do we help them counter those non-creative behaviors they're going to learn as they grow older? Well, in the neighborhood, it began with us. It began with adults. Every day we saw Fred engaged in some creative pursuits, and maybe pursuits that some of us might have said at the time, or maybe still do, well, those are childish. You know, he was painting pictures. He was cutting with construction paper. He was taking popsicle sticks and putting them together. But importantly and wonderfully, whatever he was doing, he noticed and conveyed to us how much it brought him joy. And you see, it's not just Fred that brings us that sort of joy in the neighborhood. He introduced us to countless creative adults, people like Wynton Marsalis and Julia Child and Yo-Yo Ma. But oftentimes these adults were everyday people with everyday passions, and they were regulars on the neighborhood. Think of Officer Clemens. Officer Clemens was also the neighborhood opera singer. Handyman Negri, well, he was the neighborhood guitarist. All of these guest stars and all of these characters show that creativity isn't just for kids, that we don't have to give up our creative pursuits as we grow older. Importantly, as Fred said, the best teacher in the world is the one who loves what he or she does and loves it right in front of you, which leads us to lesson 9.
Fred modeled communication. So if there's one thing that set Fred Rogers apart from your average caring adult, it was the thoughtfulness. It was the intention with which he communicated with kids. Talking, of course, is something that most of us do every day. It's not something we give a lot of thought to or ever really think about until we've said the wrong thing, or until we've hurt somebody's feelings, or maybe we've said something out of anger that we really didn't mean. Fred understood that talking with kids is an art. It's a unique art. It's one that takes lots of practice and lots of reflection. And in our book, we describe Fred's approach by borrowing a concept from Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Buddhist monk and philosopher. Many of you might be familiar with his work. Thich Nhat Hanh breaks effective communication down to 2 components: deep listening and loving speech. Let's start with deep listening, because deep listening does one particular thing. It acknowledges and respects the feelings of another person, even if we don't agree with those feelings. Now, of course, this is easier said than done, because kids, and really everybody else, sometimes have feelings that are just downright baffling to an outsider. They just don't make sense to us. But when we make space to listen to those feelings anyway, that is, without injecting our assumptions or projecting our experiences, or even sharing our well-intentioned words of wisdom, we start to do what Fred did, which is make those big, hard feelings mentionable. And as Fred liked to say, anything that's mentionable becomes more manageable. Now, this doesn't mean that we never correct kids or that we never explain our feelings. It only means that at first, we should try to listen to kids uncritically. Being supportive, Fred said, often means waiting and listening and more waiting until you're better able to understand the drama that a certain child is living through at the moment, something that may actually be keeping him or her from learning well. Now, of course, once we've done that waiting, and once we've done that listening, once we may be done a little bit more waiting after that, it's also our job to speak to children lovingly. And loving speech at its core does 3 things. It encourages, enriches, and empowers human relationships. And a great tool for thinking about how to do that was created right in Fred's hometown of Latrobe by the Fred Rogers Center. This is the Simple Interactions tool, available at simpleinteractions.org. It was first developed by Harvard professor Junlei Lee, and it's since been expanded upon in some really brilliant ways by the leadership of the Fred Rogers Center. What this tool is it's an amazing way to think about our daily interactions with children, really our daily interactions with anyone. It's a way of thinking about, do our interactions convey the sense of love and support that children need to thrive? Early learning educators across America, for example, are using this tool to recognize moments of loving speech, those moments when we're communicating our presence, those moments when we're communicating inclusion and making the kids in our care feel welcome. And those moments, they often happen without adults even knowing it. And the beauty of this tool is when we learn to recognize those moments when they happen, we learn to make more of them, each, in our own way, whoever we're with and whoever happens to be in our care.
Lesson number 10, Fred showed us how neighbors work together. So most of you know, today, 9 out of 10 of us spend at least a third of our working hours working together in teams. to say nothing of the time spent in community and certainly with families. We have to work together, even when it doesn't come so easily, and so easily it doesn't seem to come these days. Now, fortunately, we can find some answers in Fred's blueprints. In the early 1970s, a psychologist named Lynette Frieder-Kofer found that when kids watched The Neighborhood, and when they did so with a caring adult who could elaborate on the themes of the show, something interesting happened. Compared to their peers, kids who watched The Neighborhood grew more patient, more willing to wait their turn, more sympathetic to each other's feelings, and more cooperative. The key, she wrote, was that Fred's Neighborhood was a small civil society, one where characters learned to bridge their differences and pursue their shared goals. In The Neighborhood, she wrote, what is common to each situation is the careful progression and clarification of ideas and feelings that include all participants. So let's go back to Google. Only because Google is familiar to us, not because it's some perfect example. It's sort of like Fred's crayons. So in 2012, the company analyzed its own teams, trying to figure out why some teams were working and other teams didn't, even when they shared some of the same team members. And what the company found was that teams that lacked psychological safety missed their sales goals by an average of 19%. But on teams where people felt respected, where they felt safe, well, they exceeded their goals by almost the same amount. In other words, problems get solved and everyone feels safe in those settings. And learning science has shown that this sense of psychological safety and mutual respect is what powers effective collaboration. So how do we create environments like these in which kids actually learn to collaborate? Well, one way is to give them chances to practice. And in the course of our research, one of the places we visited is the Girls of Steel, which is an all-girls high school robotics team. And what the Girls of Steel do with their coaches is very Fred-like. You see, the girls' coaches create these fictional scenarios that are drawn from real situations that are familiar to the girls. And then as a team, they figure out how they're hypothetically going to handle these situations. So you can understand in practicing, they're practicing interpersonal conflict. They're practicing perspective taking. They're recognizing that they're going to stumble over their differences, of course. But by talking about this stuff in a fictionalized, judgment-free way, they start to develop the psychological safety that lets them function both as individuals and as a team in their goals. In this case, robotics.
Lesson number 11. Fred tried, Fred failed, Fred practiced, and Fred improved, and Fred always brought us along for the ride. So for Fred, the process of learning was just as important as the outcome. He showed us the value not just of mastering something, but of growing in it. You know, of discovering a skill that maybe really interests you, but also you're really bad at it at first, and you make a lot of mistakes. But eventually you start to see those mistakes as opportunities to get better. And hopefully you eventually feel the thrill of improvement, even the satisfaction of reaching a goal. Fred knew that by teaching us to love the process of learning, and by teaching us to go through that process again and again, he could counter some of the harmful messages about learning that have become somewhat entrenched in our society. I'm sure many of you have had this happen to you. You walk into a classroom, you're excited to learn, and suddenly the first thing the teacher tells you is, no one ever gets an A in this class. I'm sure you've probably been told either explicitly or implicitly by a parent, by a teacher, by someone else, that a certain subject or a certain skill or a certain sport just isn't for you. And I'm sure, most painfully, many of you have heard your friends or your colleagues be called a natural at something, only to be left wondering what that makes you. You know, it's hard to love learning if the adults around us insist in so many ways that we're not enough, or if they use the mistakes we made as a basis for judging us, rather than seeing them as markers on the road to improvement. And while it's true that tough love tactics, you know, telling someone that they're never going to get an A, might mean well, and might inspire hard work from some kids, they also push a lot of promising young people away. And the consequences of this aren't just harmful. They're more harmful to some kids than to others. One study found that when 6 and 7-year-olds were shown a game for, quote, really smart kids, fewer girls felt like playing. It's because when we talk about intelligence, when we talk about talent as a sort of fixed state, something you either have or you don't, you inevitably tell some young people that they have promise, and you tell a whole lot more not to bother. Fred, of course, took the opposite tack. In the neighborhood, everyone we met, whether it was Fred himself or the elite artists or the top athletes that he introduced us to, they all talked openly about struggle, They all talked openly about their process. They talked about how they grappled with self-doubt. They talked about how they made mistakes. And always, 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 they talked about how they eventually found help from the people they cared about most. Life, Fred said, is marked by failures and setbacks and slip-ups as much as by hard-won satisfactions and sudden discoveries of unexpected strength. We need to help children understand that for us, as for them, life is made up of striving much more than attaining. So that game I just noted for really smart kids, researchers found that when they described the exact same game as for being for kids who, quote, try really hard, girls were every bit as interested as boys. But, and this is important, science tells us that this growth mindset, as you may know it, only works when the adults around kids actually believe that those kids are capable of growing. Girls and boys alike really only benefit when the adults around them truly believe that they're capable of learning, and when adults convey that belief in ways that kids find authentic and trustworthy. Fred himself said it best. There are so many ways of learning things. And do you know what the best way is? To have someone you love help you.
So let's talk about the last tool for learning, which is about building the connection, about becoming that somebody for children. In the early 1970s, Hallmark, our greeting card company, invited celebrities to design Christmas displays for their flagship Manhattan store. Now, one display was noticeably different. It was a single pine tree, about the height of a child, encased in clear acrylic. It had no lights, no tinsel, no ornaments. It didn't even say who designed it. There was only a plaque that said, of course, we know who the designer was. If there was one message at the core of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, it was this: I like you just the way you are. And though we don't always think about feeling as accepted as a basic human need, those feelings matter as much as food and as water. And not only does our well-being depend on human relationships, so too does our capacity for learning. Now, there are all sorts of interesting studies about this, but I'll briefly share just one. So in 2002, a group of researchers gave college students a fake personality test and assigned them to groups based on their supposed results. They told one group that you're going to have rewarding, caring relationships throughout your lives. It's going to be completely joyful. They told another group that your friendships are going to fade, your marriages are going to dissolve, and you're going to end up living alone in isolation. And they told another group that you are going to be prone to horrible accidents, car crashes, falling down the stairs, all sorts of accidents and injury in your life. And then these researchers gave each group an IQ test. And the only group that bombed it was the group that had been told they'd be rejected. So even that car crash group didn't seem all that affected. And what the researchers concluded wasn't that it was bad news in general that had caused the drop in test scores, but rather the prospect of social exclusion. You see, when confronted with this horrific idea of spending their lives alone, students lost the ability to think, to reason clearly. Now, fortunately, these researchers apologized afterwards, and they assured everyone that it has all been a ruse. But this study underscores the importance of Fred's radical message of radical acceptance. Fred knew that we all need the same thing, which is this: whether we're a preschooler or a young teen, a graduating college senior or a retired person, we need to know that we're worth being proud of. And that knowledge is more than a nice feeling. You see, kids and adults have to know that they matter to the people around them, that they're worth being proud of. And we can show this to kids in lots of ways, by telling them, of course, but also by deploying all the tools that Fred Rogers gave us, by nurturing their curiosity, by protecting their creativity, by listening deeply and speaking lovingly, by building those psychologically safe spaces and seeing their promise and believing in their potential. Now, showing kids that we like them just the way they are doesn't mean that we tell them that they're perfect or that everything that they do and everything that they think is great or even okay. But what it does mean is that we refuse to reject their humanity, with all of humanity's joys and all of humanity's flaws and all of humanity's potential. You see, Fred used to say that love is an active noun like struggle, that to love someone is to struggle to accept them exactly as he or she is right now. Now, we know that's not always easy, but as adults, it's the most important gift that we can give to them.
Speaking of that gift, all of us can do a version of what Fred Rogers did. A reporter once asked Fred, what is the neighborhood? what is it that you're trying to accomplish here? And it's interesting that when Fred responded, he didn't call it a television program. Instead, he called it an atmosphere. The neighborhood, he said, is an atmosphere that allows people to be comfortable enough to be who they are. All of us, of course, have a role to play in creating that atmosphere. That's why Fred left us his blueprints. The truth of Fred's ministry, wrote his wife, Joanne, was that every last one of us can be as caring, kind, and influential in children's lives as he was. Every last one of us can do a version of what Fred did.
And that's why, returning here to Western Pennsylvania and the work of Remake Learning, all around Fred's own neighborhoods, all across Western Pennsylvania, we're investing deeply in relationships among caring adults and the caring professions, teachers, librarians, youth workers, artists, technologists, parents, and so many others to create that atmosphere that learning science tells us is necessary for great learning.
We're going to try a real quick exercise in creating that atmosphere ourselves. Lesson 14, the greatest thing we can do is let people know that they are loved and capable of loving. So this is a quote of Fred's, and really there's not a whole lot that we can add to it, except to try to add a little bit of love to the world ourselves. So we're going to do a brief exercise that Fred himself used to do when he gave speeches. And we think that this exercise sums up everything Fred did. It sums up everything the neighborhood was about. And so I'm just going to read it to you word for word. From the time you were very little, he said, you've had people who have talked you into talking, people who have sung you into singing, loved you into loving. Some of them may be here right now. Some may be far away. Some may even be in heaven. But wherever they are, if they've loved you and encouraged you and wanted what was best in life for you, they're right inside yourself. And I feel that you deserve some quiet time on this special occasion to devote some thought to them. So let's just take 30 seconds in honor of those who have cared about us all along the way. 30 silent seconds. We'll watch the time.
Lesson 14.3, 143, I love you. What can you do to show your love, to share your love, to spread your love for learning? Around the turn of the millennium, Fred issued us all a challenge. Try your best to make goodness attractive, he said. That's one of the toughest assignments you'll ever be given. Fred was right. It is tough. It's easier to tear down than it is to build. It is easier to fear than it is to love. It is easier to criticize than it is to create. But if we want to do more than just prepare future workers, if we want every child to have the freedom to discover her potential, if we want to raise creative, curious, caring kids, if we want to build stronger, more inclusive communities and a more just and loving world, then making goodness attractive is what we have to do. And whomever you've been thinking about, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a friend, or maybe even Fred Rogers himself, he or she is proof that making goodness attractive is possible. How will we do the same for our kids? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be here.
Well, Greg and Ryan, this is the first night in a long time that I really wish we were in an auditorium, because I would stand up and lead a real round of applause for you both. So thank you. That was really beautiful. That was really beautiful. We wish we could have a standing O for you tonight.
Thank you.
You've given us so much to think about, and that last little exercise was so meaningful. It truly is a practice and a climate, isn't it, to raise kids with love and curiosity.
And that's what we talk about Remake Learning. You know, the Fred method that we've been working to employ for 15 years, it really is about creating an atmosphere for learning. And maybe you can do it across an entire region like Western Pennsylvania or Northern California, but we can also create those atmospheres and should create those atmospheres in our early learning centers, our after-school programs, our campuses of higher education, in our own households. It's that atmosphere for learning that is core to everything else.
It's so true. I remember when I had my son that I thought, I've studied all the wrong stuff. I should have been studying frogs and construction equipment. What in the world? right? You learn that as a parent. All right, well, we have a few minutes. I know everyone has been so engaged and stayed with you through this whole presentation, which was wonderful and amazing.
Thank you for all those wonderful comments coming through the chat. It just means a lot to us.
Well, good. You deserve it. This was really a beautiful presentation. So here we go. Couple of questions, okay? Here's a parent who asks, is there a book that explains how to approach these, I guess, the learning lessons among adults? That's a good question. Other than your book, let's say your book.
That was my answer.
So our book is written squarely for adults, right? It's not a kid's book. It's written for parents. It's written for educators in and out of school. And Ryan and I don't pretend to be perfect parents or perfect teachers. And at the close of each chapter, we do curate these examples like Hedda Sherpin's Ask It Basket to just try and give each of us small tactical things that we can do that help us begin to think about the ways in which we employ the Fred method ourselves. What's also been entirely joyful in sharing this book is Ryan and I have gotten a number of comments from folks like, this is a book just about being a good human being. And those are Fred's words, right? Like that's Fred's lesson, because ultimately his life's passion was about making goodness attractive, about being good human beings. He was concentrated on what that meant to be a good human being in support of the children in our care, whether they're our own children or our students. But ultimately, his core was about goodness and love.
And I would add, at the risk of sounding too self-promotional with this, one of the great things about writing this book, about talking about this book, is taking it on the road. And we've had the pleasure of speaking to so many parents and so many teachers over the past few months that people are starting to now share what they're doing with us. So if you sign up for our newsletter at whenyouwonder.org, we've started to share those with our newsletter audience, because some of the things that people are coming up with are brilliant. And we've had some really great pictures come through. And, we like Greg said, we don't pretend to be the experts here. Really what we're hoping to do is create a community of folks who are following in Fred's footsteps.
I love that. Here's a comment from Sandy Sale, who is my son, who's now 34, his kindergarten teacher. And she says, as an educator, I wish all teachers could see this and read your book. Amen, Sandy.
Oh, thank you.
Required reading.
Well, it's like you said, kids start out so curious and then they lose that question asking ability. So it's up to us, right, as loving adults to figure out how to keep that. How do we keep our kids curious? How do we keep our young adults curious? We're here in Menlo Park. Facebook is here in Menlo Park. Google is just down the street. These are questions that we're thinking about all the time. All right, couple of real educator questions for you. How does time for unstructured play fit in with Fred Rogers' tools for learning?
Well, Fred's work was so much about creating time and space, right? And time might equate to structure. To struggle. It might equate to unstructured play. It equates to wondering. One of the educators that we feature in the book is a teacher by the name of Melissa Butler. And she, in her kindergarten classroom, used to, for example, give kids buttons and say, look at this button for the next few minutes. Tell me what you notice, right? And at first the kids are like, what, right? Because that was the extent of the structure. And then they start to notice things about that button. And then they started to wonder about all sorts of things. And then you can sort of really see them struggling with the questions that she was asking. And to me, it's just about creating that time and space, and certainly unstructured play, or a lesson plan that allows for a lot of what amounts to unstructured play is critical to creating that atmosphere.
It's critical. It's also can be terrifying, speaking as a former teacher, to have unstructured time in your day. I'm sure it's just as scary for a parent. Kids get bored easily. They get fidgety easily. Fred created that time and space on television, which was unprecedented. Those of you who've seen the documentary probably remember the scene where he sets an egg timer for a minute and he just lets it count down. There are scenes in the neighborhood of Fred literally sitting there watching paint dry. And what he's doing is creating that space. And what neuroscientists are finding today is that the more you can sit still and just be sort of with yourself, with your thoughts, the more creative ideas come to you. The less stimulated you are by streaming television or the internet or your cell phone, the more you can just sit there and think. The more creative, the more curious you become. And Fred, again, this is an example of him being 50 years ahead of his time when it comes to things like that.
So true. One of the things that we loved, a silver lining for our teenagers during the pandemic, was time. Time to think, time to sit, time to sleep, time to pick up a hobby. And we hope that those are things that the adults can encourage kids to keep doing, right? Okay, here's a good question in this same vein, Ryan. How do you regain curiosity if it is lost?
That's a really good question.
It is.
And so one of the most interesting things about Fred is that he made these things a habit. Taking just kindness. Fred used to get up at 5 a.m. every single day. So he would have time to think about who he was going to interact with that day. He would think about, who am I going to meet with? Who am I going to come across on the street? Who am I going to work with on the neighborhood set? How am I going to treat them? He knew that it was so essential to have these habits of mind so that he himself didn't lose them. Now, in terms of curiosity specifically, I don't know that it ever truly goes away. I think it's really a matter of remembering, what are the things that used to light me up? Maybe that was 5 years ago, maybe it was 10, maybe it was 50 years ago. Everybody has something that they were at some point interested in. And I think we need to make it a habit to give ourselves time to revisit those things, to remember what lit us up, to dive back into it again and again ourselves, because as we referenced at the beginning, attitudes are caught, not taught. And the more kids see us being curious, the more kids see us being excited about something, even if they could care less about the thing that we're excited about, it's the attitude that matters, not the specific questions we have or interests we have. Curiosity is caught, not taught.
Yeah, I felt my immediate response to that is we don't lose our curiosity. The response really is, have we created an atmosphere where curiosity can flourish? One of the people that we interviewed in our book is Bill Strickland, who created the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, which has spread to other places from San Francisco to Sharon, Pennsylvania. And Bill Strickland worked closely with Fred Rogers, and he says something so simple, that environment drives behavior. So it's the physical environments that we create, but it's also those things that we do. Are we creating a safe environment where kids feel like they belong, where their questions are going to be respected, where they can comfortably ask questions, where they can comfortably ask about hard topics? Fred took on some really hard topics. Imagine a children's media host today hosting a program that might address race or hatred or divorce or other things that even young kids wonder about. He created that space where kids could wonder and struggle through all sorts of topics. It's that atmosphere for learning. And if we find that we're in spaces where curiosity and creativity are suppressed, it's really up to us as adults to rebuild that atmosphere.
So true. Thank you, Greg. That is a wonderful clarification. So here's a related question. Do you think that current work around diversity, equity, and inclusion could be framed in Fred Rogers' universal message of, I like you just the way you are? Could we accept others and possibly improve how we connect with one another? So is DEI really, does it boil down to a Fred Rogers message, I guess is the question.
Ryan, you're muted.
I think you're right that is, that's the end goal. That is what, any human being wants. There's a wonderful poem by the author Raymond Carver where somebody asks the narrator, what is it that you want? And he responds, to be beloved on the earth. And I think we see a lot of that in what Fred was doing. We see a lot of that in DEI work. The point is to, yes, like others exactly as they are. But as Fred showed us in the program, that can often be much easier said than done. And I think the beauty of DEI is, in order to like someone just the way they are, we have to take the step of getting to know them and figuring out how it is that they want to be seen, how it is that they want to be heard. Fred did that all the time in the neighborhood. And there are a couple of examples in the book of folks doing that in really approachable, welcoming ways. even among high school students. Greg, I'm thinking of the Global Minds Initiative, which was started by a high school student here in Pittsburgh. She noticed one day that there was a student who happened to be an immigrant in her classroom, and she turned and just started talking to her, just started getting to know her. Their friendship became the seed from which this international program has since sprouted, called the Global Minds Initiative, in which kids are doing exactly that. They're finding ways to show one another, I respect you, I see you, I hear you. And after doing all of that, I like you just the way you are.
Well, and when I think about conversations about DEI or certainly CRT now, so many of the discussions are, well, if you win, I lose. Yeah. Well, Fred approached this in a very different way. He said, it is fair for every child to feel like he or she belongs. And if it is fair for every child to feel like he or she belongs, that it's important for them to see themselves in their experiences around them, to see themselves in the adults around them, to know that they're loved and capable of loving. And, Fred, as a host and as a person of this world, talked publicly about love and creating that loving environment. And so there is something to be said about grounding the work of justice in the work of love, and how Fred made that so concrete and practical in ways that are instructive to us today.
Well, that is really beautifully said, Greg. Okay, now that we are busy solving the problems of the world, here's another one. What do you think about creativity and technology, e.g. Minecraft?
Well, when I think about Fred, we talk about the folks involved in Remake Learning. Sometimes we describe him as modern day Fred Rogers, which in one sense is fair because they themselves are trying to identify the things that are attractive to young people and make them good and constructive. It's unfair because, as Fred Rogers himself would say, like, I want you to be the best Charlene. I want you to be the best Ryan. Like, don't be Fred. So when we think about technology, I think we have to think about any software or device as nothing more than fire, the fulcrum, or the printing press, right? Like, is this tool developmentally appropriate? And is it something that we can use to inspire learning? And for some kids, their passions and interests are going to be lit up by video games and software like Minecraft. And it could be a potentially great thing. And is Minecraft like a crayon that leads to other things of learning where you start bumping up and you find yourself in that vortex where you start absorbing other information around you? It's all about how and when and why we use whatever we're using, whether it's Minecraft or a crayon.
I think you're muted again.
Thank you. I'll stop doing that. People often ask us, what would Fred think about Facebook or Twitter or Instagram? Yeah. And we always respond, look, we can't speak for Fred, but we can learn from his own approach to television. Fred Rogers was as repulsed by television. He found it as alien as I find TikTok. And yet he made it his responsibility to find the good in that technology. He didn't like that television demeaned other people. Well, social media can demean people in a whole lot, to a level that he probably never could have dreamed of. And yet he ran toward the fire, so to speak. He found a way to make this technology a way of sharing that core message, again, going back to, I like you just the way you are. And I think, we need a lot more of that on just about every platform these days.
So true. So we have just a couple of minutes, and I always like to end with this final question. And I don't think I've ever had two presenters on screen who are more equipped to answer it. Oh, and no. The question is, what gives you hope, Greg and Ryan?
Oh my gosh, so many things give me hope. I'm privileged to work at the Grable Foundation in a job that allows me to support educators in and out of school, to find ways to support parents, families, and caregivers, and ultimately support our young people. And I think just about these past few months, here we are emerging from a period of toxicity and trauma and trying to imagine a post-pandemic future. And there were 1,000 educators all across Western Pennsylvania and the state of Pennsylvania who came together this summer to identify the building blocks of things that we want in our post-pandemic learning futures in our schools, museums, libraries, and other sites of learning. And to identify the very concrete things that we might do to bring about that future of learning. As one example, imagine if every school, every public school, had a director of relationships, not a counselor, not replacing counselors, not a teacher, and not replacing the amazing active or silent mentoring that teachers do, but someone who does nothing more than 24/7 thinks about building the social capital for each and every student and finding ways to address the experience gaps that he or she may have because of their life circumstances. Well, that's not such a crazy idea, right? 10 years ago, there weren't directors of instructional innovation in our schools. And now they're pretty uniform across so many school districts in America. Well, what if we had directors of relationships in that way? That's just one example of concrete ideas that more than 1,000 educators imagined into being, of things that we can do. And when I think about the hope and optimism that they have about creating a post-pandemic learning future that's much more Fred-like, that employs that Fred method, I get pretty darn excited about what's ahead.
We can tell, Greg. It's really, and yes, I agree. That absolutely should be. All right, Ryan, I don't know if you always get the last word, but tonight you do.
Oh, well, thank you. And in fact, I'm going to give the last word to someone else. This is someone we quote in the book. I'm just going to read it very briefly.
Okay.
Kids walk into classrooms and learning spaces excited. They want to learn, they want to make, they want to redesign worlds. And when we, the adults, don't make space for that, we squash all of that creativity. We tell them, you can't do those things that you're dreaming about. Now fit this mold and meet these standards. How do we think about possibilities instead? How do we think about the ways that people dream and imagine better futures? Why don't we start by asking, what do you dream about that you never talk about? What do you do if only you could? Now, that is a quote from a woman named Dr. Valerie Kinloch. And what gives me hope is that Dr. Valerie Kinloch is the Dean of Education, Dean of the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. She is one of so many people we had the incredible fortune to meet who are Fred-like in so many ways, who are following in Fred's footsteps and making his blueprints modern. And the fact that people like Dr. Kinloch are in positions like that, Dean of Education, brings me so much hope, because there are modern day Fred Rogers everywhere, and they are changing the world, one person at a time.
Well, thank you so much, Greg and Ryan. Everybody, we love this book. Please do get it. It works for parents with kids of every age, whether you have little bitty ones. I have a grandchild on the way. I'm sending it to my son. Or whether you have teenagers or college age kids. I'm not kidding. This is a wonderful book. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us tonight. We are honored and thrilled. Thank you, everybody, for being with us, all the wonderful and warm comments in chat. Take care, everybody. Stay well, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night, everyone.